Nice princess tattoo, Barbie! What's next, a unicorn tramp stamp?
Sergeant Marcus Kane's booming voice cut through the morning California heat like a blade, making every head at Naval Special Warfare Center turn toward the small blonde woman standing at attention on the training ground. Emma Mitchell stood perfectly still, her light gray t-shirt clinging to her slim frame, blonde curls escaping from her high, messy bun, blue eyes fixed straight ahead, the dragon tattoo on her right arm, intricate black scales coiling around ancient symbols, seemed to pulse under the harsh Coronado sun as 20 elite SEAL trainees erupted in cruel laughter. "Look at that detailed artwork," sneered Petty Officer Jake Morrison, his phone already recording. "Bet she spent her daddy's money on that instead of actual training." "This isn't a beauty pageant, sweetheart." The circle of muscular men closed tighter around Emma, their combat boots grinding against the red dirt as they sensed weakness. Captain David Wilson watched from the elevated platform, his weathered face showing the kind of dismissive annoyance reserved for diversity hires who clearly didn't belong among America's elite warriors. But what none of these highly trained killers realized was that they were about to witness something that would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about strength, about warriors, and about the quiet blonde woman whose dragon tattoo held secrets that could reshape the entire operation. In exactly 18 minutes, when that innocent-looking design was finally recognized for what it truly represented, the most dangerous man in the facility would freeze mid-sentence and ask a question that would change everything. Who authorized that insignia? The morning briefing had started like any other at 0600 hours, with fresh recruits filing into the concrete amphitheater that had broken more dreams than California earthquakes. Emma had slipped in through the back entrance, her government-issued duffel bag slung over one shoulder with the kind of casual precision that only someone watching very carefully would notice. The weight distribution was wrong for standard civilian packing, too balanced, too strategic. Marcus Kane owned this space the way apex predators own their territory. 6 feet 4 inches of pure intimidation wrapped in desert camouflage, he had built his reputation on breaking the weak and forging the strong. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Listen up, recruits," Marcus's words echoed off the concrete walls. "Today we separate the warriors from the wannabes. Today we find out who belongs here and who needs to catch the next bus back to mommy." His eyes swept the assembled crowd like a spotlight hunting for victims, lingering on the few women scattered among the predominantly male group. When his gaze landed on Emma, sitting quietly in the third row with her hands folded in her lap, something predatory flickered across his features. "You!" He pointed directly at her, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Blondie in the back, you lost? Yoga class is downtown." The laughter started as a ripple and built to a wave. Emma didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't give them the reaction they were hunting for. She simply met Marcus's stare with those steady blue eyes that had seen things these men couldn't imagine. "What's your name, recruit?" Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space with the kind of aggressive positioning that had made countless trainees crumble. "Emma Mitchell, Sergeant." Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying just enough respect to avoid insubordination while revealing nothing about the steel beneath the surface. "Emma Mitchell," Marcus repeated her name like it was something distasteful. "And what makes you think you belong here, Emma Mitchell?" "I applied, Sergeant, same as everyone else." The simplicity of her response seemed to infuriate him more than any show of defiance would have. Marcus had built his career on reading people, on finding their pressure points and exploiting them. But this small blonde woman was giving him nothing to work with, except an infuriating calm that made him look foolish in front of his audience. After the briefing, as recruits filed out toward their barracks assignments, Emma found herself walking alone across the sprawling base. The architecture here was all hard angles and utilitarian brutality, designed to remind everyone who passed through. That comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. She moved through the space with the kind of situational awareness that had kept her alive in places where most people died, cataloging exit routes and potential threats with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom paranoia was a survival skill. The barracks assignment officer barely looked up from his clipboard when Emma approached his desk. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had processed thousands of recruits over his 15-year career, and they all blended together into a faceless mass of ambition and desperation. "Mitchell, Emma, Bunk 17, Building C, no smoking, no drinking, no fraternization. Lights out at 2200 hours. Any questions? No, Sergeant. As Emma walked toward Building C, her movements caught the attention of someone watching from a second-story window. Colonel Richards lowered his binoculars with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested whatever he had seen was both unexpected and significant. He reached for his secure phone and dialed a number that existed in no official directory. "It's Richards. We may have a problem. Send me everything you have on recruit Emma Mitchell, full background, and I mean everything." Building C smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Emma found Bunk 17 in a room she would share with 7 other women, each of whom was trying to project the kind of tough-as-nails attitude they thought belonged in this environment. The bunks were arranged with military precision, each surrounded by a locker and a small desk that had seen better decades. Emma's belongings unpacked with the kind of methodical efficiency that made her bunkmate pause in her own chaotic unpacking process. Every item had a specific place. Every piece of equipment was checked and double-checked before being stored. Her clothes folded into perfect squares that would have impressed a drill sergeant. Her gear arranged in patterns that spoke of muscle memory earned through repetition. "Holy cow, you sure you're not military?" asked Rebecca Chase, a redhead from Ohio whose nervous energy filled the room like static electricity. "That's some serious organization." "Just like things neat," Emma replied. But Rebecca noticed how her hands moved without hesitation, finding the optimal configuration for limited space as if she had done this 1,000 times before. What Rebecca didn't see was the small device Emma placed in the back corner of her locker, hidden behind a stack of regulation t-shirts. To a casual observer, it looked like a standard civilian electronics charger. To someone with the right clearance and equipment, it would register as a military-grade encrypted communication device capable of quantum encrypted transmissions to recipients who officially didn't exist. The mess hall represented democracy in its purest form, everyone equally miserable regardless of rank or background. Emma joined the line with her regulation tray, moving through the serving area with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. The food was exactly what institutional cuisine always was, nutritionally adequate and completely forgettable. She had just found an empty table in a corner that offered good sightlines to all entrances when Marcus Kane materialized beside her, like a storm cloud looking for something to rain on. "Well, well, Princess Emma, all alone." His voice carried that particular brand of cruel amusement that bullies had perfected since the beginning of time. "Where are all your friends?" Emma continued eating without looking up, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "Making friends wasn't in the curriculum, Sergeant." "Oh, we got ourselves a smart mouth." Marcus's grin widened as he gestured to his crew, who had been watching from across the room, like jackals waiting for permission to join the hunt. "Boys, come meet our new celebrity recruit." Jake Morrison was the first to slide into the seat across from Emma, his phone already in position to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Petty Officer Davis Thompson took the seat to her left, close enough that she could smell the aggressive cologne he used to mask his insecurity. Corporal Ryan Walker completed the circle, his massive frame blocking Emma's view of potential exit routes with the kind of calculated intimidation that these men had turned into an art form. "So, Emma," Marcus leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a predator playing with its food. "Tell us about that pretty little tattoo of yours. Dragon, right? Very artistic, very feminine." "It's personal, Sergeant." "Personal?" Marcus's voice rose with mock surprise. "Everything's personal here, sweetheart. We're all family. Isn't that right, boys?" The chorus of agreement from his crew sounded like wolves howling. Other recruits at nearby tables tried to pretend they weren't watching, but Emma could feel their attention like heat from a fire. Some watched with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that drew crowds to car accidents. Marcus reached across the table and flicked Emma's tray, sending a spoonful of mashed potatoes splashing across her shirt. "Oops, clumsy me. Guess you'll need to get that cleaned up before inspection." The mess hall had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of industrial ventilation and the distant clatter of kitchen cleanup. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see how the small blonde woman would respond to this calculated provocation. Emma set down her fork with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. She stood slowly, her movements controlled despite the food staining her regulation shirt. When she spoke, Her voice carried no anger, no fear, just a kind of tired patience that somehow made Marcus's cruelty look childish. "Accidents happen, Sergeant." She picked up her tray and walked toward the disposal area, her back straight and her pace unhurried. The silence followed her like a wake until she disappeared through the exit, leaving Marcus and his crew sitting in a room full of witnesses who had just seen something they couldn't quite name. If you're already feeling that surge of anger watching Emma face this injustice, smash that like button right now, because this story is about to get incredible. And hit subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. Quick question while we're here. Where are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments, because I love seeing our global community come together over stories like this. Lieutenant Amy Johnson had been watching the mess hall incident from the officers section, her own meal forgotten as she witnessed Marcus Kane's latest display of casual cruelty. As a woman who had fought her own battles to earn respect in this male-dominated environment, she felt a surge of sympathy for the blonde recruit who had just been publicly humiliated. Amy found Emma an hour later in the equipment storage facility, methodically cleaning the stains from her shirt with the kind of focused attention that suggested this was neither the first nor the worst humiliation she had endured. The storage room smelled like gun oil and canvas, filled with racks of gear that represented millions of dollars in taxpayer investment. "That was handled well," Amy said from the doorway, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her rank through competence rather than politics. "Marcus was testing you, seeing how you'd react." Emma looked up from her cleaning, taking in Amy's lieutenant bars and the kind of composed professionalism that marked her as someone who had survived and thrived in this environment. "And how did I do, ma'am?" "Better than most." A lot of recruits would have either broken down or tried to fight back. Both reactions would have given him ammunition. Amy stepped into the room, her movements casual, but her eyes alert. "Mind if I ask what brings you here? This place isn't exactly a popular destination for most women." "Same thing that brings everyone here, I suppose. Looking for something." Amy studied Emma's face, searching for the tells that usually revealed a person's true motivations. Desperation, anger, patriotism, adventure-seeking. She had seen them all. But Emma's expression remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing beyond polite attention. "Well, if you need someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like being one of the few women in this environment, my door's always open." Amy handed Emma a small card with her contact information. "We have to look out for each other." What Amy didn't mention was the phone call she had received that morning from a number she didn't recognize. A voice that had spoken with the kind of authority that didn't need to identify itself. The message had been simple: watch the new recruit Emma Mitchell and report anything unusual. The voice had emphasized that this was a matter of national security and that failure to comply would have consequences for Amy's career and her family's safety. As Amy walked away, Emma examined the card with the same careful attention she gave everything else. The contact information was standard military issue, but there was something in the paper's texture and the printing quality that suggested resources beyond what a typical lieutenant would have access to. She filed this information away in the mental database that had kept her alive through operations that officially never happened. The first physical training test came at 0500 hours the next morning, when the California sky was still dark and the air carried the kind of chill that promised another blazing day. Emma arrived at the training ground in regulation PT gear that had seen better years, her equipment showing the kind of wear that came from use rather than neglect. Master Sergeant Joe Palmer had been running PT tests at Coronado for 12 years, and he prided himself on his ability to predict who would wash out within the first week. The small blonde woman stretching by herself in the corner of the field didn't fit any category in his mental database. She wasn't trying to prove anything with aggressive displays of strength, wasn't bonding with other recruits, wasn't showing the kind of nervous energy that marked most first-day trainees. "Listen up, people," Palmer's voice carried across the field like a gunshot. "Today, we find out who's been lying on their application forms. 5-mile run, full obstacle course, swimming qualification. Anyone who can't keep up can start packing." The run started as a mob and quickly sorted itself into a hierarchy based on conditioning and determination. Emma settled into a pace that kept her in the middle of the pack, neither fast enough to draw attention nor slow enough to raise questions. Her breathing remained controlled, even as others around her began to struggle, her footfalls maintaining the same rhythm that would carry her through whatever distance was required. Marcus Kane had positioned himself at the front of the group, his longer stride and superior conditioning allowing him to set a punishing pace that would break the weak and identify the strong. He periodically looked back over his shoulder, searching for signs of distress among the recruits who were falling behind. When his gaze found Emma, still maintaining her steady pace while others around her gasped and stumbled, something flickered across his features that might have been surprise. This small woman who looked like she belonged in a fashion magazine rather than a military training facility was not only keeping up, but looked like she could maintain this pace indefinitely. The obstacle course separated the pretenders from the contenders with the kind of brutal efficiency that had been refined over decades of military training. Rope climbs, wall scaling, mud crawls under barbed wire, tire runs that left even strong men gasping, each element designed to find physical and mental limits and then push beyond them. Emma approached each obstacle with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. But observers with trained eyes began to notice details that didn't fit the profile of a typical recruit. Her rope climbing technique was too clean, her movement through the mud too efficient, her recovery time between obstacles too quick for someone learning these skills for the first time. Dr. Amanda Walsh watched from the medical station, her trained eye cataloging the subtle signs that distinguished natural talent from learned expertise. As the base psychologist, she had evaluated thousands of recruits and developed an instinct for reading the stories their bodies told. Emma Mitchell's story included chapters that hadn't been written in any civilian gym. "Interesting technique," Dr. Walsh murmured to her assistant, making notes on her tablet. "Look at her approach to the wall climb. She's not learning the movement, she's remembering it." The swimming test took place in a pool that had claimed more SEAL dreams than enemy action ever would. 50 meters underwater, no breathing apparatus, with instructors whose job was to simulate the kind of panic-inducing situations that awaited in real combat operations. Emma entered the water without hesitation, her body adjusting to the temperature change, with the kind of controlled breathing that spoke of extensive aquatic training. She moved through the water with an efficiency that made the other swimmers look clumsy by comparison, her stroke mechanics showing the kind of refinement that came from thousands of hours of practice. What made the instructors exchange glances was not just her speed or technique, but her apparent comfort with the underwater portion of the test. While other recruits struggled with breath control and panic management, Emma moved through the submerged section like someone for whom this environment was as natural as walking on land. Master Sergeant Palmer watched Emma climb out of the pool with dry marks time that would have been respectable for a trained Navy swimmer, let alone a recruit on her first day. She wasn't even breathing hard, her heart rate returning to normal, with the kind of rapid recovery that indicated a cardiovascular system trained for extreme performance. "Mitchell," Palmer called out as Emma toweled off. "Where'd you learn to swim like that?" "High school swim team, Sergeant." It was a perfectly reasonable answer that explained nothing. High school swim teams didn't produce the kind of underwater endurance Emma had just demonstrated, and they certainly didn't teach the combat swimming techniques Palmer had observed during her test. That evening, as Emma cleaned her gear in the equipment room with the same methodical precision that marked all her actions, she noticed things that would have been invisible to most observers. Scratches on certain weapons that indicated recent use despite being marked as training-only equipment. Serial numbers that had been altered with professional skill. Ammunition counts that didn't match the official logs. Someone was running unauthorized operations out of this facility, using official training as cover for activities that would never appear in any official report. Emma photographed these discrepancies with a device disguised as a standard military-issue flashlight, uploading the images to servers that existed in the shadow space between official intelligence agencies. Emma's specialized combat gear included cutting-edge medical monitoring technology originally developed for special operations personnel. The advanced biometric tracking systems featured real-time heart rate variability analysis and stress response monitoring, allowing operatives to maintain peak performance under extreme pressure. These military-grade health monitoring devices, now adapted for civilian use, provide comprehensive physiological data that helps users optimize their training and recovery protocols for maximum effectiveness. The second day brought weapons training, and with it the first real test of Emma's carefully constructed cover identity. The M4 carbine was standard issue for SEAL training, a weapon system that had proven itself in conflicts around the world through reliability and accuracy in the hands of trained operators. Weapons instructor Chief Petty Officer Martinez had seen every possible reaction to firearms training: fear, excitement, overconfidence, and incompetence. What he hadn't seen was the kind of casual familiarity that Emma displayed as she approached the weapon for the first time in her official capacity as a recruit. Her weapons handling was textbook perfect, but carried subtle efficiencies that spoke of extensive practical experience. The way she conducted her safety check, the smooth precision of her magazine insertion, the natural pointing stance she adopted. These were details that separated weekend enthusiasts from professional operators. "Mitchell," Martinez called out, after watching her first string of fire produce a grouping that would have been impressive for a trained marksman. "You sure this is your first time with military weapons?" "Yes, Chief. My father took me hunting when I was younger." Another perfectly reasonable explanation that explained everything and nothing. Hunting rifles and military carbines were different animals entirely, requiring different skill sets and different mindsets. Yet Emma had just produced shot groups that suggested familiarity with this specific weapon system. Marcus Kane had been watching Emma's performance with growing irritation. Each test that should have broken her only seemed to reveal new depths of competence, making his initial assessment look increasingly foolish. His authority depended on his ability to identify weakness and exploit it, but this small blonde woman was giving him nothing to work with. During the afternoon hand-to-hand combat instruction, Marcus finally saw his opportunity. Physical combat was his specialty, the area where his size and strength advantages would be overwhelming. If he couldn't break Emma mentally, he would do it physically in front of everyone. The combat training took place in a gymnasium that smelled like sweat and ambition, its walls lined with safety mats that had absorbed the blood and frustration of countless trainees. Instructor Sergeant Davis Thompson had fought professionally before joining the military, and his classes were notorious for their intensity and their casualty rate. "Today we learn that size and strength matter," Thompson announced to the assembled recruits, "but technique and determination matter more. We're going to pair up and see who's been paying attention." When Marcus volunteered to demonstrate with Emma, the room went silent with anticipation. Everyone understood what was about to happen. The small woman who had been annoying Marcus with her competence was about to receive a public lesson in physical reality. Emma stepped into the center of the mat with the same calm she brought to everything else. But those watching carefully noticed subtle changes in her positioning. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, her hands relaxed but ready, her gaze focused on Marcus's center mass rather than his intimidating stare. "Don't worry, Princess." Marcus's voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. "I'll try not to hurt you too badly." The engagement lasted exactly 28 seconds. Marcus came forward with the kind of aggressive rush that had overwhelmed countless opponents, his superior reach and weight providing overwhelming advantages against normal opposition. But Emma wasn't normal opposition, and what happened next defied every assumption about how this confrontation should have ended. Emma moved like water around Marcus's attacks, her defensive positioning so precise that his strikes missed by inches while appearing to come much closer. She used his momentum against him, redirecting his energy with subtle touches that turned his strength into a liability. When she finally chose to engage offensively, it was with a combination of speed and precision that left Marcus flat on his back before he understood what had happened. The gymnasium went completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's labored breathing and the whisper of ventilation fans. Emma stood over him, with her hand extended to help him up, her expression showing no triumph or satisfaction, just the kind of professional courtesy that made Marcus's defeat even more humiliating. "Good match, Sergeant," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying no mockery despite the reversal of positions. Thompson ended the class early, his own understanding of combat dynamics shaken by what he had just witnessed. In 15 years of instruction, he had never seen a smaller fighter dominate a larger opponent with such complete technical superiority. Emma's movements had displayed the kind of refinement that came from advanced training and practical application under life-or-death circumstances. The tension is building, and I can feel you getting invested in Emma's story. If you're curious about what that dragon tattoo really means, show some love with a like. The next few minutes are going to blow your mind, so stick around. That evening, Amy Johnson found herself in an unmarked sedan parked outside the base perimeter, speaking into a phone whose number she was instructed to forget after each use. The voice on the other end belonged to someone whose identity was hidden behind layers of classification that extended far beyond Amy's security clearance. "What's your assessment of the Mitchell situation?" The voice was professionally neutral, giving away nothing about the speaker's identity or agenda. "She's not what she appears to be," Amy replied, watching the base lights flicker in the distance. Her performance indicators are off the charts. Combat training, weapons handling, physical conditioning, everything suggests prior experience at a level that's not reflected in her official records. Any indication she's aware of surveillance? Amy hesitated before answering, remembering the way Emma's eyes had tracked potential threats during their conversation, the subtle positioning that kept exit routes clear, the kind of situational awareness that marked professionals rather than civilians. I think she assumes she's being watched. Whether she knows the specific details is unclear, but she's operating with the kind of caution that suggests operational training. Continue monitoring, report any changes immediately. The line went dead, leaving Amy staring at her phone with the growing certainty that she was caught in the middle of something far more complex and dangerous than a simple recruitment evaluation. The fact that Emma Mitchell had attracted this level of attention from people who spoke with that kind of authority suggested that whatever was happening here had implications that extended far beyond SEAL training. Inside her barracks room, Emma sat on her perfectly made bunk, ostensibly reading a training manual, but actually monitoring encrypted communications through the device hidden in her locker. The messages flowing through quantum-encrypted channels painted a picture of a situation that was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. 3 Shadow Dragons operatives had gone dark in Eastern Europe. Communication intercepts suggested that classified training protocols had been compromised. Someone with high-level access was selling information to parties whose identities remained hidden behind layers of digital obfuscation that would take weeks to penetrate. Emma's mission parameters were simple in concept, but extraordinarily complex in execution. Identify the source of the information leak, determine the scope of the compromise, and neutralize the threat without revealing her own identity or mission. The fact that the leak appeared to be originating from within the SEAL training community made her current position both valuable and extremely dangerous. Colonel Richards sat in his office, staring at computer screens displaying information that shouldn't have existed. Emma Mitchell's official records showed a perfectly ordinary background: middle-class family, unremarkable academic performance, no military service, no red flags of any kind. But the deeper he dug, the more apparent it became that these records had been constructed with the kind of professional skill that suggested intelligence community involvement. Birth certificates that were too perfect, employment records that couldn't be verified, educational transcripts from institutions that confirmed her attendance but couldn't provide details about her academic performance. It was a background that would pass casual inspection but fell apart under the kind of scrutiny that Richards was trained to apply. More disturbing were the gaps, periods of months where Emma Mitchell seemed to have simply vanished from all official records, leaving no digital footprint despite living in an age where complete invisibility required resources and expertise that most people couldn't access. Richards reached for his secure phone and dialed a number that connected him to people whose job it was to know things that others weren't supposed to know. I need everything you have on a potential asset currently operating under the identity Emma Mitchell. Priority, 1 classification, full intelligence workup, including psychological profile and operational history. The response came back within hours, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope that would be incinerated after reading. The contents confirmed Richards' worst suspicions, while raising questions that threatened to destabilize his carefully constructed plans. Emma Mitchell was a ghost, an operative whose true identity was buried beneath layers of classification that reached into the highest levels of the intelligence community. Her presence at Coronado was no accident, and her mission was almost certainly connected to the unauthorized operations that Richards had been conducting under the cover of routine training exercises. The next morning brought advanced tactical training, conducted in environments designed to simulate the kind of urban combat that had become the primary mission for special operations forces. The facility was a maze of mock buildings, vehicle obstacles, and pop-up targets that could be reconfigured to create infinite variations of combat scenarios. Emma moved through these exercises with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. But trained observers began to notice patterns that suggested familiarity with not just the general concepts, but the specific tactical doctrines being employed. Her movement through urban environments showed the kind of sophistication that came from real-world application rather than classroom instruction. During a building clearing exercise, Emma's team encountered a scenario designed to test decision-making under pressure. Multiple potential threats, limited time, civilian considerations. the kind of complex situation that separated leaders from followers and exposed the depth of an operator's training. Emma took point without being asked, her movements through the mock building showing the kind of tactical awareness that made other team members instinctively fall into supporting positions. She cleared rooms with a precision that suggested extensive practical experience, her weapon handling and positioning flowing with the kind of muscle memory that took years to develop. Marcus Kane watched from the observation platform, his jaw clenched with the kind of frustration that came from watching his authority erode in real time. Every exercise that should have exposed Emma's limitations only revealed new depths of competence, making his initial assessment look increasingly foolish and his continued harassment seem petty and unprofessional. "She's making you look like an amateur," Jake Morrison commented, his voice carrying just enough insubordination to be dangerous. Marcus turned on him with the kind of sudden violence that had earned him his reputation. "You got something to say, Morrison?" "Just observing, Sergeant. Just observing." But the damage was done. Other team members had heard the exchange, had seen Marcus's reaction, had begun to question whether their loyalty to him was misplaced. Emma Mitchell might be an outsider, but she was proving herself while Marcus looked increasingly like a bully picking on someone whose only crime was being better than he expected. The evening brought individual evaluations, conducted in the privacy of soundproof rooms where instructors could speak freely about recruit performance without concerns about morale or politics. Emma sat across from Dr. Walsh, her posture relaxed but alert, her hands folded in her lap with the same careful precision that marked all her movements. "How are you finding the training so far?" Dr. Walsh asked, her tone professionally neutral, but her eyes searching for the subtle tells that revealed a person's true state of mind. "Challenging but manageable," Emma replied, her voice carrying the same careful neutrality that she brought to all official interactions. "Any concerns about integration with your fellow recruits? I understand there have been some personality conflicts." Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Personality conflicts are inevitable in high-stress environments. Learning to work through them is part of the training." Dr. Walsh made notes on her tablet, documenting not just Emma's words, but the subtle body language that accompanied them. The way Emma's breathing remained controlled, despite discussing obvious stress factors, the careful positioning that kept potential escape routes clear, the micro-expressions that suggested someone accustomed to maintaining operational security under questioning. "Your performance indicators have been exceptional across all categories. Have you given any thought to what specialty you might want to pursue if you complete the program?" "I'm focused on completing basic training first. Specialization seems premature." Another perfectly reasonable answer that revealed nothing while deflecting attention from areas Emma preferred not to discuss. Dr. Walsh recognized the technique from her own training in resistance to interrogation, a skill set that wasn't typically found among civilian recruits. That night, as Emma conducted her equipment maintenance with the same methodical precision that marked all her actions, she became aware of surveillance that was more sophisticated than the casual observation she had been expecting. Multiple watchers, coordinated timing, electronic monitoring that suggested resources far beyond what a typical training facility would employ. Someone was taking her presence here very seriously, and that meant her carefully constructed cover identity was beginning to fracture under scrutiny. She had perhaps 48 hours before the investigation reached levels that would expose not just her true identity, but the mission that had brought her here. Emma opened the encrypted communication device hidden in her locker and composed a message using protocols that would make her transmission invisible to standard monitoring equipment. The message was simple: "Cover may be compromised. Request guidance on acceleration timeline." The response came back within minutes, carrying the kind of urgency that confirmed her assessment of the situation. "Maintain cover at all costs. Target identification critical. Extract protocols authorized if necessary." Emma deleted the message and closed the device, her mind already shifting into the kind of operational planning that had kept her alive through missions that officially never happened. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities to gather the intelligence she needed while maintaining the facade that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. As she settled into her bunk for another night of carefully controlled sleep, Emma allowed herself a moment to consider the irony of her situation. She had spent years learning to be invisible, to blend into environments where detection meant death, to maintain false identities under the kind of pressure that broke most people. Now she found herself in the opposite position, trying to appear ordinary while her exceptional abilities made her stand out like a beacon. Every skill that made her valuable as an operative also made her suspicious as a recruit, creating a contradiction that threatened to expose everything she was working to protect. The dragon tattoo on her arm seemed to pulse with its own rhythm in the darkness, its intricate design hiding secrets that would reshape everything if their true meaning was discovered. But that revelation would have to wait for another day, another crisis, another moment when careful planning gave way to desperate improvisation. For now, Emma Mitchell would continue to be exactly what she appeared to be, a small blonde woman trying to prove herself worthy of joining America's elite warriors, carrying secrets that could change the world if they were ever revealed. The third day of training brought advanced marksmanship evaluation, conducted on ranges that stretched across miles of California desert, where the margin for error was measured in millimeters, and the difference between success and failure could determine entire military careers. Emma arrived at the firing line with the same quiet efficiency that had marked all her activities, her equipment showing the kind of care that spoke of someone who understood that weapons were tools rather than toys. Range Master Chief Petty Officer Carlos Miller had overseen marksmanship training for 8 years, during which time he had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict shooter performance based on stance, breathing, and the subtle tells that separated natural marksmen from those who would struggle to hit targets at combat distances. What he saw when Emma approached the firing line didn't fit any category in his mental database. Her shooting position was textbook perfect, but carried refinements that spoke of advanced instruction beyond what any civilian shooting program would provide. The way she adjusted her scope showed familiarity with military-grade optics. Her breathing pattern indicated training in combat shooting techniques, and her grip configuration suggested someone accustomed to sustained fire under stress conditions. "Mitchell, you're up," Miller called out, his voice carrying across the range with the authority of someone whose word was absolute law in this environment. 300 meters, 10 rounds, standard NATO ball ammunition. Let's see what you've got. Emma settled into position with movements that flowed like water, her body finding the optimal shooting stance with the kind of muscle memory that took thousands of rounds to develop. She made minor adjustments to her scope with the confident precision of someone who understood ballistic compensation, windage calculation, and the dozen other variables that affected long-range accuracy. The first shot rang out across the desert like thunder, followed by 9 more, in a rhythm that spoke of controlled breathing and perfect trigger control. When the target was retrieved, Miller stared at the results with the kind of disbelief reserved for witnessing the impossible made routine. 10 shots, 10 hits, all within a grouping that would have been impressive for a trained sniper, let alone a recruit on her third day of training. The shot placement showed not just accuracy, but the kind of tactical thinking that separated combat marksmen from target shooters, each round positioned to maximize damage if this had been a real engagement rather than a training exercise. "Holy cow," Miller muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My father was very thorough, Chief." Another perfectly reasonable explanation that explained everything and nothing. Miller had trained with Olympic-level marksmen, with police snipers who had decades of experience, with military shooters whose skills had been honed in combat zones around the world. Emma Mitchell had just outperformed all of them, with the casual ease of someone for whom this level of precision was routine rather than exceptional. Marcus Kane watched from the observation tower, his binoculars focused on Emma, with the kind of intensity that suggested personal rather than professional interest. Each demonstration of her capabilities felt like a personal insult, a challenge to his authority and his carefully constructed identity as the alpha predator in this environment. "She's making us all look bad," Jake Morrison commented, his voice carrying the nervous edge of someone whose confidence was beginning to crack. "No recruit shoots like that. No civilian shoots like that." "Then maybe she's not what she claims to be," Marcus replied, his voice dropping to the kind of dangerous quiet that had preceded violence in the past. "Maybe it's time we found out what Emma Mitchell is really hiding." The afternoon brought close-quarters combat training in environments designed to simulate the kind of urban warfare that had become the primary mission for Special Operations Forces. The facility was a maze of interconnected rooms and corridors where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died, where hesitation was often fatal and overconfidence was always dangerous. Emma moved through these scenarios with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. but observers with trained eyes began to notice details that suggested familiarity with not just the general concepts, but the specific tactical doctrines being employed. Her room-clearing techniques showed the kind of sophistication that came from real-world application, her movement patterns indicating training in advanced urban combat methodologies. During a hostage rescue simulation, Emma found herself designated as team leader for a scenario that had been designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure. Multiple potential threats, limited time, civilian considerations that could turn a successful mission into a catastrophic failure with a single wrong choice. She approached the problem with the same methodical precision that marked all her actions, but her tactical planning revealed depths of knowledge that shouldn't have existed in someone with her official background. Her briefing to the team showed understanding of specialized equipment, knowledge of classified protocols, awareness of operational security considerations that were typically restricted to personnel with extensive special operations experience. "Mitchell's running this like she's done it before," observed Sergeant Tommy Roberts, a veteran instructor whose own combat experience gave him the expertise to recognize authentic tactical knowledge. "That's not textbook planning, that's field-tested operational doctrine." The exercise proceeded with Emma's team moving through the mock facility with the kind of coordinated precision that typically took months to develop. Her leadership style was subtle but decisive, using hand signals and positioning to guide her team through the scenario while maintaining the kind of situational awareness that kept everyone focused on their assigned sectors. When they encountered the primary threat room, Emma's approach revealed training that went far beyond standard military protocols. She positioned her team with the kind of tactical awareness that minimized exposure while maximizing firepower, her own movement showing familiarity with advanced entry techniques that were typically classified as special operations methodologies. The scenario concluded with a successful hostage rescue and the neutralization of all hostile targets, achieved in a time that set a new facility record. But what made observers exchange meaningful glances was not just the success, but the sophistication of the tactics employed, the level of coordination achieved, and the obvious expertise Emma had demonstrated in an environment where lives would have depended on such decisions. Amy Johnson watched from the observation booth, her own tactical background giving her the knowledge to understand what she was witnessing. As someone who had fought to prove herself in this male-dominated environment, she recognized the difference between natural talent and learned expertise. Emma Mitchell was displaying skills that took years to develop and practical experience to refine. More troubling was the phone call Amy had received that morning, delivered through channels that bypassed normal military communications and spoke with the kind of authority that made refusal impossible. The voice had been clear about expectations. Maintain close surveillance on Emma Mitchell, report any indicators of advanced training or knowledge beyond her official background, and prepare for potential action if her true identity was confirmed. The caller had also made it clear that Amy's own family situation made her particularly vulnerable to pressure. Her younger sister's medical bills, her parents' financial struggles, the scholarship that had made her own military career possible, all of these could be affected by her level of cooperation with this unofficial investigation. That evening, as Emma conducted her routine equipment maintenance in the privacy of her barracks room, she became aware of surveillance that had escalated beyond casual observation. Electronic monitoring of her communications, physical surveillance during off-duty hours, database searches that were leaving digital footprints designed to probe the boundaries of her cover identity. Someone was systematically dismantling the carefully constructed background that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny. The investigation was being conducted by people with resources and expertise that suggested involvement at levels far above what a typical security review would warrant. Emma opened her encrypted communication device and composed a message using protocols that would make her transmission invisible to all but the most sophisticated monitoring equipment. The message was brief but urgent. Hostile investigation confirmed. Cover degradation accelerating. Request immediate guidance on mission timeline. The response came back within minutes, carrying authorization codes that confirmed the message's origin from the highest levels of the intelligence community. Mission parameters unchanged. Target identification remains priority. Maintain cover until revelation becomes unavoidable. Extract protocols armed and ready. Emma deleted the exchange and secured her equipment, her mind already shifting into the kind of operational planning that had kept her alive through missions and environments where discovery meant death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she sensed that the careful balance she had maintained between revealing too little and revealing too much was about to collapse entirely. The next morning brought hand-to-hand combat evaluation, conducted in a gymnasium where the mats had absorbed the blood and sweat of countless training sessions. The air smelled like determination and fear in equal measure, while fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows that made every movement look more dramatic than it was. Combat instructor Master Sergeant Davis Thompson had built his reputation on his ability to expose the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. His classes were notorious for their intensity and their ability to reveal character under pressure, separating those who could fight from those who merely thought they could. "Today we find out who's been watching too many action movies," Thompson announced to the assembled recruits, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made everyone straighten unconsciously. "We're going to pair up for live combat training. No rules except don't permanently disable your partner." When Marcus Kane volunteered to partner with Emma for the demonstration, the atmosphere in the gymnasium shifted from routine training to anticipated spectacle. Everyone understood the subtext. This was Marcus's opportunity to publicly establish dominance over the recruit who had been undermining his authority through her competence. Emma accepted the pairing with the same quiet calm she brought to everything else, but those watching carefully noticed subtle changes in her positioning and demeanor. Her stance shifted slightly, her weight distribution changed, her breathing pattern modified in ways that suggested she was transitioning from training mindset to something more serious. "Don't worry, Princess," Marcus's voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. "I'll try to make this educational rather than painful." The engagement began with Marcus testing Emma's defenses through a series of probing attacks designed to gauge her skill level and identify weaknesses he could exploit. What he discovered was that Emma's defensive capabilities were far more sophisticated than her small frame and quiet demeanor suggested. She moved with the kind of fluid efficiency that made his attacks seem clumsy by comparison, redirecting his force rather than opposing it directly, using his momentum and aggression against him with techniques that showed advanced training and combat methodologies that weren't part of standard military curriculum. As the sparring session continued, Marcus's confidence began to erode as he realized that Emma wasn't just defending successfully, but was actually controlling the pace and flow of the engagement. Every attack he launched was countered with increasing sophistication. Every attempt to use his size advantage was neutralized by superior technique and tactical awareness. The turning point came when Marcus, frustrated by his inability to land a meaningful strike, abandoned technique in favor of brute force. He launched a haymaker punch intended to end the session decisively, putting his full weight and strength behind a blow that would have dropped most opponents. Emma slipped the punch with a movement so slight it seemed like Marcus had simply missed, then responded with a combination of strikes that was too fast for most observers to follow clearly. The sequence lasted less than 3 seconds, but when it was over, Marcus found himself flat on his back, gasping for air, while Emma stood over him with her hand extended to help him up. The gymnasium went completely silent, except for the sound of ventilation fans and Marcus's labored breathing. Emma's expression showed no triumph or satisfaction, just the kind of professional courtesy that made Marcus's defeat even more humiliating. "Thank you for the training, Sergeant," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying no mockery, despite the complete reversal of expected outcome. Thompson ended the session immediately, his own understanding of combat dynamics shaken by what he had just witnessed. In 20 years of instruction, he had never seen a smaller fighter dominate a larger opponent with such complete technical superiority, using methods that suggested training far beyond what any civilian program would provide. Dr. Amanda Walsh watched from the medical observation station, her psychological training giving her insights into the dynamics that had just played out. The way Emma had handled victory, without gloating, without humiliation, with quiet dignity, suggested someone accustomed to violence as a tool rather than an expression of dominance. More significant was Marcus's reaction to defeat. Instead of the explosive anger that typically characterized his responses to challenges, he looked confused and somehow diminished, as if his entire worldview had been shaken by this encounter with someone whose capabilities exceeded his understanding. "I know you're probably holding your breath right now, waiting for the big reveal. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, give it a like and let me know in the comments. Are you Team Emma or were you fooled too? That afternoon brought the investigation to a new level of intensity as Colonel Richards received intelligence reports that confirmed his worst suspicions about Emma Mitchell's true identity. The documents, delivered through channels that existed in the shadows between official agencies, painted a picture of someone whose presence at Coronado represented either an extraordinary opportunity or an existential threat. Emma Mitchell was a ghost, an operative whose official existence had been carefully erased to enable operations that required absolute deniability. Her real name was classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. Her operational history was sealed under national security provisions that made even acknowledging her existence a federal crime. The file contained references to operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and a dozen other locations where American interests required intervention that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Her confirmed kill count was redacted, but the operational summaries suggested someone whose effectiveness had made her valuable enough to justify the extraordinary resources required to maintain her cover identity. Most troubling was the indication that her presence at Coronado was not accidental. Someone had inserted her into the SEAL training program for reasons that the intelligence reports couldn't or wouldn't specify, but the implications were clear. She was investigating something that threatened national security at the highest levels. Richards reached for his secure phone and placed a call to contacts whose existence was never officially acknowledged, but whose influence extended into the darkest corners of the intelligence community. "We have a confirmed Shadow Dragons operative in our facility," Richards said without preamble. "I need to know why she's here and what she's looking for." The response was immediate and chilling. "Terminate investigation immediately. Do not engage. Do not alert target to surveillance. Await further instructions." But Richards had already gone too far to simply abandon his inquiry. The unauthorized operations he had been conducting under the cover of routine training exercises were worth millions of dollars to the foreign contacts who had been purchasing classified information. If Emma Mitchell was investigating those operations, his entire network was at risk. The financial security systems used to protect classified military operations utilized the same advanced encryption and risk assessment protocols now available for high-net-worth individuals seeking comprehensive asset protection. These institutional-grade financial security services include offshore account structures, emergency fund protocols, and crisis management planning that ensure wealth preservation even in extreme circumstances, providing the same level of financial operational security used by government agencies. The evening brought what would prove to be the final phase of Emma's carefully maintained masquerade, though none of the participants yet understood how dramatically the situation was about to change. The training schedule called for night operations practice, conducted in environments designed to simulate the kind of low-visibility combat that had become increasingly common in modern warfare. Emma prepared for the exercise with the same methodical precision that marked all her activities, but her equipment selection revealed subtle preferences that spoke of extensive practical experience in night operations. Her choice of gear, her weapons configuration, even the way she applied camouflage paint, showed familiarity with tactics and equipment that were typically restricted to special operations personnel. Marcus Kane approached the exercise with the kind of aggressive determination that suggested he viewed this as an opportunity to redeem himself after the afternoon's humiliation. His plan was simple: use the cover of darkness and the confusion of combat simulation to engineer a situation where Emma would be isolated, vulnerable, and available for the kind of personal attention he felt she deserved. The exercise began at 2200 hours, with teams moving through a mock village where hidden threats could appear from any direction. Emma found herself assigned to Marcus's unit, a pairing that everyone understood was intentional rather than coincidental. As the team moved through the darkened streets, Marcus began implementing his plan to separate Emma from the group and create an opportunity for private confrontation. He assigned her to increasingly isolated positions, ostensibly for tactical reasons, but actually to remove witnesses from whatever was about to happen. What Marcus didn't understand was that Emma had been aware of his intentions from the moment the exercise began. Her night vision capabilities, enhanced by training in environments where detection meant death, had allowed her to track his movements and anticipate his strategy with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of surviving in hostile territory. When Marcus finally made his move, approaching Emma's position with the kind of predatory confidence that had served him well in previous encounters, he discovered that his intended victim had become something else entirely, The small blonde woman who had appeared so vulnerable in daylight transformed in darkness into something far more dangerous. "Time for a private lesson, Princess," Marcus whispered, as he closed the distance between them, his voice carrying the kind of menace that had intimidated countless previous targets. Emma turned to face him, and for the first time since arriving at Coronado, her carefully maintained facade began to crack. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before, a coldness that suggested Marcus had finally pushed too far. "Last warning, Sergeant, walk away." But Marcus had passed the point where warnings mattered. He reached for Emma with the confident aggression of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance, his hands moving to grab her in a manner that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with personal dominance. The confrontation that followed lasted exactly 11 seconds, but those 11 seconds would reshape everything that came after. Emma's response to Marcus's assault was swift, decisive, and utterly professional in its application of violence designed to neutralize a threat while minimizing permanent damage. When it was over, Marcus lay unconscious in the dirt while Emma stood over him, her breathing controlled and her expression calm, despite having just demonstrated capabilities that no civilian recruit should have possessed. But the most significant consequence of the encounter was not Marcus's condition, but the fact that his grabbing and falling had torn Emma's shirt from shoulder to mid-back, exposing the tattoo that she had kept hidden since arriving at the facility. The dragon design was revealed in its full complexity under the harsh illumination of the exercise floodlights. Intricate black scales that seemed to move in the shifting shadows, ancient symbols worked into the creature's wings and body, eyes that stared with a kind of predatory intelligence that made observers uncomfortable. But it was the details within the design that would prove most significant, elements that marked this as far more than decorative body art. Chief Petty Officer Miller, responding to reports of an incident during the exercise, arrived to find Marcus unconscious and Emma standing in the light with her tattoo fully exposed. His reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath followed by the kind of stillness that comes from recognizing something that shouldn't exist. "Holy cow," Miller breathed, his voice barely audible. "That's not possible." But before he could process the full implications of what he was seeing, Captain David Wilson arrived on scene, drawn by radio reports of a training incident that required immediate command attention. Wilson took in the situation at a glance: the unconscious sergeant, the torn clothing, the exposed tattoo, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that ranged from confusion to recognition to something approaching fear. Because Captain Wilson had seen that tattoo design before, in classified briefings about operations that officially never happened, he knew what the symbols meant, understood the significance of the dragon's positioning, and the meaning of the ancient text worked into the design. More importantly, he knew that only 12 people in the world were authorized to bear that particular mark. "Everyone back," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made immediate obedience automatic. "Clear this area immediately. This is now a classified situation." As the training exercise was suspended and the area was secured, Emma stood in the harsh floodlight illumination, with her secret finally exposed. The carefully constructed identity that had protected her for months was crumbling in real time, replaced by questions that threatened to expose not just her true purpose, but the entire operation that had brought her to Coronado. Wilson approached slowly, his movements careful and respectful, in a way that suggested he understood exactly who and what he was dealing with. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of reverence typically reserved for legends that had unexpectedly become real. "Who authorized that insignia?" The question was asked in a whisper, but it carried across the suddenly silent training ground with the weight of official recognition. Emma met his gaze steadily, and when she responded, her voice carried none of the careful deference that had marked her interactions as a recruit. Instead, it held the quiet authority of someone accustomed to operating at levels where hesitation could have global consequences. "Shadow Dragon's authorization remains classified, Captain. Level 7 clearance required for confirmation." The words hit Wilson like a physical blow, confirming what the tattoo had already suggested. Emma Mitchell was not just a military operative, but a member of the most elite and secretive special operations unit in American military history. Shadow Dragons existed in the space between official policy and necessary action, conducting operations that required absolute deniability and operators whose existence could never be officially acknowledged. "Ma'am," Wilson said, and his use of the honorific was automatic and respectful, "I need to contact command immediately." But even as Wilson reached for his radio, Emma was calculating the implications of her exposure. The mission that had brought her to Coronado was now compromised beyond recovery, but the intelligence she had gathered about unauthorized operations and security breaches was too important to abandon. Marcus Kane regained consciousness to find himself at the center of a situation that was far beyond his understanding. Military police had secured the area. Officers with security clearances he didn't know existed were asking questions he couldn't answer. And the small blonde woman he had tried to assault was standing in conversation with command personnel who were treating her with the kind of deference usually reserved for general officers. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with confusion and the after effects of whatever Emma had done to render him unconscious. "You just attacked a Shadow Dragons operative," Miller explained, his own voice carrying disbelief at the magnitude of Marcus's error. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Marcus didn't understand, but as the full scope of his mistake became clear through the reactions of everyone around him, he began to grasp that his military career had just ended in the most catastrophic way possible. You didn't assault a member of America's most elite special operations unit and continue serving in the military, regardless of what excuses or justifications you might offer. Dr. Walsh arrived on scene as part of the command response team, her psychological training making her valuable for assessing the mental state of everyone involved in what was clearly a situation with implications far beyond a simple training incident. But her attention was immediately drawn to Emma, whose behavioral patterns had suddenly shifted from careful concealment to something approaching professional confidence. "The stress indicators are completely different," Dr. Walsh observed to her assistant. "She's not trying to blend in anymore. She's operating." The transformation was visible to anyone with the training to recognize it. Emma's posture had changed from the careful submissiveness of a recruit to the confident bearing of an operator. Her situational awareness had expanded to encompass the entire facility, rather than just immediate threats. And her interactions with command personnel showed the kind of professional respect between equals rather than the deference expected from trainees. Within an hour, the training facility had been transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation, with specialists arriving from installations across the country to assess the implications of Emma's exposure. The unauthorized operations that Colonel Richards had been conducting, under the cover of routine training, were about to come under scrutiny from people whose job it was to protect national security from internal threats. Amy Johnson found herself in an interrogation room, facing questions from investigators whose credentials placed them far above her security clearance level. The phone calls she had been receiving, the pressure to monitor Emma's activities, the implied threats against her family, all of it was now being examined under the harsh light of a security investigation that could end careers and result in criminal charges. "The voice on the phone," the lead investigator asked, "did you recognize any identifying characteristics? Accent, speech patterns, background noise?" Amy realized that her cooperation with the unknown caller might have made her an accessory to espionage, depending on who had been receiving the information she had been providing. The investigation was revealing a web of unauthorized activities that extended far beyond simple training irregularities. Colonel Richards, meanwhile, had disappeared from the facility entirely, his office cleared out and his personal effects removed, with the kind of efficiency that suggested advanced planning. The discovery of his absence triggered immediate protocols for dealing with potential defectors, including alerts to international law enforcement agencies and the activation of assets designed to track individuals who might be attempting to flee American jurisdiction. Emma stood in the command center that had been established to coordinate the investigation, no longer pretending to be anything other than what she was. The Shadow Dragon's insignia on her exposed back caught the light as she moved, its intricate design serving as both identification and warning to anyone who understood its significance. "Mission parameters have changed," she said into a secure communication device that had materialized from equipment she had kept hidden throughout her time at the facility. "Target has been flushed but not captured. Secondary objectives require immediate implementation." The response came from channels that existed outside normal military communications, carrying authorization codes that placed this operation at the highest levels of national security priority. "Understood. Full operational authority granted. All available resources at your disposal." What had begun as a covert investigation into security breaches had just escalated into an active counterintelligence operation with implications that extended far beyond the SEAL training facility. Emma's exposure had been costly, but it had also forced the enemy network into the open where it could be identified and neutralized. The tension is building, and I can feel you getting invested in Emma's story. If you're curious about what that dragon tattoo really means, show some love with a like. The next few minutes are going to blow your mind, so stick around. The next 12 hours brought revelations that reshaped everyone's understanding of what had been happening at the Naval Special Warfare Center. The investigation team, working with resources that Emma's authorization had made available, uncovered a network of unauthorized operations that had been ongoing for over 2 years. Colonel Richards had been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services, using his position to identify promising recruits who could be compromised or eliminated before they became operational threats. The training exercises that had seemed routine were actually cover for meetings with enemy contacts, weapons testing for non-American clients, and the recruitment of personnel who could be positioned within other military units for future exploitation. Marcus Kane found himself facing charges that would end his military career and likely result in federal prison time. His assault on Emma had been bad enough, but the investigation revealed that he had been a willing participant in Richards' network, using his position to identify recruits who might pose threats to the operation and either discouraging them from continuing or arranging for their elimination through training accidents. "I had no choice," Marcus insisted during his interrogation, his former confidence completely shattered. "Richards had files on everyone. He knew things about my family, my background, things that could destroy us if they came out." The investigators were unsympathetic. Military personnel were expected to resist coercion and report attempts at compromise, regardless of personal consequences. Marcus's cooperation with a hostile intelligence network made him a traitor, regardless of his motivations or the pressure he had been under. Jake Morrison, faced with evidence of his own involvement in the network, chose cooperation over loyalty to his former leader. His testimony provided details about how the recruitment and elimination process had worked, how potential threats had been identified, and how promising candidates had been either compromised or removed from service. "We were told it was about maintaining standards," Jake explained, his voice shaking with the realization of what he had been part of. "That we were protecting the integrity of the service by making sure only the right people got through training." What Jake had actually been part of was a systematic program to identify and eliminate American military personnel who might pose threats to foreign intelligence operations. His cooperation in harassing Emma hadn't been about maintaining standards, but about forcing a Shadow Dragon's operative out of service before she could complete her investigation. Amy Johnson's situation was more complex, as investigators worked to determine whether her monitoring of Emma had been willing cooperation or coerced assistance. The threats against her family were real, documented through communications that the investigation team had recovered from compromised devices, but her level of awareness about what she was participating in remained unclear. "I knew something was wrong," Amy admitted during her debriefing. "The questions they wanted me to ask, the information they wanted me to gather, it went beyond normal security concerns. But they made it clear that refusal wasn't an option." The investigators were more sympathetic to Amy's situation, recognizing that she had been placed in an impossible position through threats against family members. Her cooperation would be considered in determining what charges, if any, would be filed against her. Dr. Walsh's involvement was minimal but significant. Her psychological evaluations had been used to identify recruits who might be susceptible to compromise or elimination. Her professional assessments had been perverted into intelligence gathering tools, making her an unwitting accomplice to activities that violated every principle of medical ethics. "I never intended for my evaluations to be used against the people I was trying to help," Dr. Walsh said, her voice carrying the weight of professional betrayal. "The psychological profiles were meant to identify who needed additional support, not who should be targeted for elimination." The scope of the compromise was staggering. Dozens of promising military personnel had been eliminated from service over the past 2 years. Their careers ended through manufactured failures, arranged accidents, or compromising situations that forced them out of the military entirely. The American military had been systematically weakened through the removal of its most capable personnel. Emma's investigation had been triggered by pattern analysis that identified unusual attrition rates among high-performing recruits, combined with intelligence indicating that classified operational doctrines were appearing in foreign military training programs. The Shadow Dragons unit had been tasked with identifying the source of the leaks and neutralizing the threat before more damage could be done. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity, Emma explained during her briefing to senior command personnel. By eliminating high-potential recruits before they became operational, the network could weaken American military capability while appearing to maintain standards and discipline. The investigation also revealed the true scope of Colonel Richards's operation: bank accounts in multiple countries, communication networks that bypassed military monitoring systems, contacts within foreign intelligence services that extended back decades. This had been a long-term penetration operation that had achieved significant success before being exposed. Most troubling was the indication that Richards's network was part of a larger structure that extended into other military installations, intelligence agencies, and government departments. The investigation at Coronado had exposed one cell of a much larger organism that threatened national security at the highest levels. Elite military training programs employ specialized psychological preparation and legal framework education that civilian professionals can now access through advanced executive development courses. These comprehensive programs include crisis leadership training, high-stakes negotiation protocols, and legal risk management strategies originally designed for special operations commanders, now adapted for corporate executives and entrepreneurs facing complex business challenges. The consequences of the investigation's revelations rippled outward from Coronado like shockwaves from an explosion, affecting not just the individuals directly involved, but the entire structure of military training and security protocols. Within 24 hours of Emma's identity being confirmed, teams of investigators were deployed to installations across the country to assess whether similar compromise operations were being conducted elsewhere. Marcus Kane's military career ended with a court-martial that resulted in a dishonorable discharge and a federal prison sentence of 15 years for espionage and treason. His cooperation in providing information about Richards's network reduced what could have been a life sentence, but couldn't absolve him of responsibility for betraying his oath and endangering national security. During his sentencing hearing, Marcus was given the opportunity to address the court and the personnel he had betrayed. His statement was brief but carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I allowed fear to make me a traitor," Marcus said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I convinced myself that I was protecting my family, but what I was really doing was destroying the principles I had sworn to defend. I have no excuse for my actions and no right to ask for forgiveness from the people I betrayed." Emma was present for the sentencing, not out of vindictiveness, but because her testimony was required to establish the scope of the damage that Marcus's actions had caused. When given the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement, her words reflected the kind of professional objectivity that characterized all her actions. "Sergeant Kane made choices that placed personal considerations above national security," Emma said. "Those choices had consequences not just for him, but for the American military personnel whose careers were ended through his cooperation with hostile intelligence services. Justice has been served through this proceeding. Jake Morrison received a lesser sentence due to his cooperation with investigators and his status as someone who had been manipulated rather than recruited as a willing asset. His military career was ended, but his civilian future remained possible if he could demonstrate that his cooperation had been genuine rather than calculated." Amy Johnson faced the most complex legal situation as prosecutors worked to determine whether her actions constituted willing cooperation with hostile intelligence or coerced assistance under threat. The investigation ultimately concluded that, while she had technically violated security protocols, her cooperation had been obtained through duress, and she had not been aware of the true nature of the network she was supporting. Lieutenant Johnson's situation highlights the vulnerability of military personnel to coercion through threats against family members, the lead prosecutor explained. While her actions were technically illegal, the circumstances suggest that she was a victim rather than a willing participant. Amy received a formal reprimand and was required to undergo additional security training, but she was allowed to continue her military career. The experience had changed her perspective on service and sacrifice, making her more aware of the complex pressures that could compromise even well-intentioned personnel. Dr. Walsh faced professional rather than legal consequences for her unwitting participation in the network. Her medical license remained valid, but she was required to undergo additional training in research ethics and was prohibited from conducting evaluations that could be used for security clearance determinations. Dr. Walsh's situation demonstrates the importance of understanding how professional expertise can be exploited by hostile intelligence services, her ethics review board concluded. While her intentions were appropriate, her failure to recognize how her work was being misused contributed to activities that threatened national security. The broader consequences extended far beyond individual punishments, reshaping military training protocols and security procedures in ways that would affect generations of service members. The investigation had revealed vulnerabilities in personnel security that required fundamental changes in how military personnel were recruited, trained, and monitored. New protocols required multiple independent evaluations for all personnel assigned to sensitive positions, enhanced monitoring of communications between training facilities and external contacts, and the implementation of systems designed to detect the kind of pattern analysis that had allowed Richards's network to operate undetected for so long. Emma's role in exposing the network earned her recognition at the highest levels of government, but the nature of her work meant that such recognition would never be public. The Shadow Dragons unit operated in the space between official policy and necessary action, requiring absolute secrecy about both its personnel and its operations. Your service has prevented damage to American national security that could have taken decades to repair, the letter from the Secretary of Defense stated. The network you exposed was compromising our military capabilities in ways that would have made future conflicts significantly more dangerous for American personnel. But Emma's work was far from over. The investigation at Coronado had revealed connections to similar operations at other installations, foreign intelligence networks that were still active, and threats to national security that required the kind of response that only Shadow Dragons operators could provide. The phone call came as Emma was preparing to leave Coronado, her mission officially complete, but her war far from over. The voice on the encrypted communication device was familiar, carrying the kind of authority that made argument impossible and delay dangerous. "We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe," the voice explained. 3 Shadow Dragons operatives have gone missing while investigating similar network penetration operations. Intelligence suggests they may have been compromised or eliminated. Emma listened to the briefing with the kind of professional attention that had kept her alive through operations in environments where distraction meant death. The Eastern European situation was connected to the Coronado network, part of a larger structure that threatened American interests on a global scale. "Timeline for deployment?" Emma asked, already knowing that her answer would be immediate, regardless of personal preferences or official obligations. "Transport leaves Coronado in 2 hours. Full operational authority, unlimited resources, presidential oversight. This is now our highest priority mission." As Emma gathered her equipment and prepared for deployment to a new theater of operations, she reflected on the irony of her situation at Coronado. She had come to the facility hoping to maintain her cover while gathering intelligence about security breaches. Instead, she had been forced to reveal her true identity in order to expose a network that threatened the foundations of American military security. The experience had also revealed something about herself that she hadn't expected: the difficulty of maintaining false identities when surrounded by people whose own service and sacrifice made deception feel like betrayal. The recruits at Coronado were volunteers who had chosen to risk their lives for principles they believed in, making Emma's necessary deceptions feel more personal than professional. But such considerations were luxuries that Shadow Dragons operators couldn't afford. Their work required the ability to become whatever identity was necessary to complete missions that protected American interests, regardless of personal feelings or professional preferences. Emma's story isn't over yet, and neither is the justice she's about to serve. If you want to see more incredible stories of hidden warriors, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, what's coming next will leave you speechless. The departure from Coronado took place under cover of darkness, with Emma boarding an aircraft that existed outside normal military transportation systems. The plane itself was unmarked, its registration numbers changed regularly to prevent tracking by hostile intelligence services that monitored American military movements. As the aircraft lifted off from the California coast, Emma reviewed the intelligence files that detailed the Eastern European situation. The 3 missing operatives had been investigating similar network penetration operations at NATO training facilities, suggesting that the Coronado network was part of a much larger structure that threatened alliance security rather than just American interests. The missing operatives were Ghost, Shadow Dragon's personnel, whose identities were classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. Their disappearance suggested either capture by hostile intelligence services or elimination by network personnel who had discovered their investigation. The mission parameters are simple in concept, but complex in execution, the briefing document explained. Locate the missing operatives, determine the scope of network penetration in NATO facilities, and neutralize the threat without creating international incidents that could destabilize alliance relationships. Emma understood that this mission would require all the skills that had made her valuable as a Shadow Dragon's operative. The ability to operate in hostile territory, to maintain false identities under pressure, to distinguish between legitimate security concerns and hostile intelligence operations, and to eliminate threats with the kind of precision that left no evidence of American involvement. The aircraft flew through the night toward Europe, carrying Emma toward a mission that would test everything she had learned about survival, deception, and the application of violence in service of national security. Behind her, the lights of California faded into darkness, but ahead lay challenges that would require every skill she had developed through years of operations that officially never happened. As Emma settled into her seat and began the mental preparation that would transform her from the woman who had been exposed at Coronado into whatever identity would be required for her next mission, she allowed herself a moment to consider the recruits she was leaving behind. Some of them would complete their training and join the ranks of America's elite warriors, carrying forward the traditions of service and sacrifice that had built the strongest military in world history. Others would find that their capabilities didn't match their ambitions, returning to civilian life with the knowledge that they had tested themselves against the highest standards and learned something valuable about their own limits. All of them would carry forward the knowledge that service meant more than personal advancement, that some responsibilities were worth accepting regardless of personal cost, and that the freedoms they enjoyed were protected by people whose names would never appear in history books, but whose contributions made democracy possible. The investigation at Coronado had exposed a network that threatened to undermine everything these recruits were training to protect. Emma's work had helped preserve the integrity of American military training and the security of operations that kept the world safe from those who would exploit freedom for their own purposes. But as the aircraft carried her toward new dangers in Eastern Europe, Emma knew that the war between those who protected freedom and those who would destroy it was eternal, requiring constant vigilance from people whose dedication to duty exceeded their concern for personal safety. The Shadow Dragons would continue their work in the space between official policy and necessary action, conducting operations that protected American interests while maintaining the kind of absolute secrecy that made their effectiveness possible. They were ghosts in service of democracy, warriors whose existence could never be officially acknowledged, but whose contributions made liberty possible. As the aircraft crossed into international airspace, Emma Mitchell closed her eyes and began the transformation that would turn her into whatever identity was required for her next mission. The dragon tattoo on her back seemed to pulse with its own rhythm in the aircraft's dim lighting, its intricate design holding secrets that would reshape the world if they were ever fully revealed. Outside the aircraft windows, the Atlantic Ocean stretched toward a horizon where new challenges waited, new threats that would require the kind of response that only Shadow Dragon's operatives could provide. The war for freedom never ended, but neither did the dedication of those who chose to fight it in the shadows, where heroes operated without recognition and victory was measured in threats eliminated rather than battles won. Emma's story would continue in places that didn't appear on any map, against enemies whose existence was never officially acknowledged, in service of principles that made such sacrifice worthwhile. The dragon would fly again, carrying the fire that protected freedom from those who would extinguish it forever. The phone rang one final time as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, its encrypted signal penetrating the sophisticated communication shielding that protected the aircraft from electronic surveillance. Emma answered with the kind of professional readiness that characterized all her interactions with command authority. "Status report on Eastern European assets?" the familiar voice asked. "Deployment proceeding on schedule. Mission parameters understood. Full operational authority confirmed." "Understood. Dragon 7, you are cleared for autonomous operation. Rules of engagement are unrestricted. Bring our people home." "Dragons never abandon their own," Emma replied, using the unit motto that had sustained her through missions that tested the limits of human endurance and professional skill. "I'm on my way." The communication ended, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts as the aircraft carried her toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. But she was not truly alone. She carried with her the knowledge that her exposure at Coronado had protected American interests, that her sacrifice of cover identity had preserved the security of operations that kept the world safe from those who would destroy freedom for their own purposes. The dragon tattoo on her back was more than decoration or identification. It was a commitment to principles that transcended personal safety, a promise that some responsibilities were worth accepting, regardless of cost, a symbol of dedication to duty that would guide her through whatever challenges waited in the darkness ahead. As the aircraft flew through the night toward Europe, Emma Mitchell prepared for the next chapter in a war that never ended, fought by warriors whose names would never be remembered, but whose contributions made remembrance possible. The Shadow Dragons would continue their eternal vigil, protecting freedom from threats that most people would never know existed, ensuring that democracy survived to fight another day. The mission continued, as it always had and always would, carried forward by people whose dedication to duty exceeded their concern for personal recognition. They were America's hidden guardians, the shadows that protected the light, the dragons that kept the fire of freedom burning, no matter how dark the night became. 6 months after the Coronado incident, the ripple effects continued to reshape American military training in ways that would influence generations of service members. The Naval Special Warfare Center had been transformed from a routine training facility into a case study in counterintelligence operations, with security protocols that served as models for installations worldwide. Rebecca Chase stood at attention in the same gymnasium where Emma Mitchell had revealed capabilities that defied explanation, but the atmosphere was fundamentally different now. The new training protocols emphasized not just physical and tactical competence, but the kind of critical thinking that could identify and resist compromise attempts by hostile intelligence services. The Mitchell protocols, and as they had come to be known in classified circles, required multiple independent evaluations of all personnel, enhanced monitoring of communications patterns, and systematic analysis of training outcomes to detect the kind of manipulation that had allowed Richards' network to operate undetected for years. Rebecca had been among the few recruits who witnessed Emma's transformation from apparent victim to revealed operative, and the experience had changed her understanding of what service truly meant. She now served as a peer counselor for new recruits, helping them understand that strength came in many forms, and that assumptions about capability based on appearance could be both dangerous and wrong. The most important lesson from the Mitchell case, Rebecca explained to a group of incoming trainees, is that real warriors don't always look like what we expect. The person sitting next to you might be someone whose capabilities exceed your understanding, and your job is to support them regardless of what they look like or where they come from. The new training emphasized respect and inclusion not as politically correct abstractions, but as operational necessities. In environments where lives depended on trust and cooperation, prejudice and harassment weren't just morally wrong, they were tactically dangerous, potentially compromising missions and endangering personnel. Master Sergeant Joe Palmer, who had overseen Emma's initial physical training evaluation, now served as the primary instructor for the Enhanced Security Awareness Program. His curriculum included case studies of how hostile intelligence services exploited personal biases and organizational weaknesses to compromise military operations. Enemy intelligence services study our culture, our prejudices, our assumptions, Palmer explained to packed auditoriums of military personnel. They use our own biases against us, inserting operatives who look like what we expect to see while eliminating threats who don't fit our preconceptions. The training materials included careful analysis of how Richards' network had operated, showing how systematic harassment and manufactured failures had removed high-potential personnel from service, while protecting assets who appeared to fit cultural expectations. The case studies were sobering reminders of how institutional biases could be weaponized against national security. Dr. Amanda Walsh had rebuilt her career around understanding how professional expertise could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. Her new research focused on developing evaluation techniques that could identify potential security threats while protecting the privacy and dignity of personnel being assessed. The challenge is maintaining the legitimate need for psychological evaluation while preventing the kind of exploitation that occurred during the Richards operation, Dr. Walsh explained to a conference of military psychologists. We must be able to assess mental health and stability without creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by hostile intelligence services. Her work had contributed to new protocols that required multiple independent evaluations, peer review of all assessments, and systematic monitoring of how psychological profiles were used in personnel decisions. The goal was to maintain the benefits of professional evaluation while eliminating the vulnerabilities that had been exploited at Coronado. Amy Johnson had chosen to remain in military service despite the trauma of her experience with coercion and manipulation. Her testimony about how family threats had been used to force her cooperation had led to new support systems for military personnel whose families might be vulnerable to hostile pressure. The enemy doesn't just target the individual service member, Amy explained during congressional testimony about military family security. They target our loved ones, using our natural desire to protect family as a weapon against national security. We need systems that can protect military families while maintaining operational security. The Family Security Initiative that resulted from Amy's advocacy provided enhanced protection for military dependents, secure communication systems for families during sensitive operations, and support networks for personnel who might be targeted for coercion through family threats. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Emma Mitchell continued operations that would never appear in official records, but whose success could be measured in threats eliminated and American personnel brought safely home. The 3 missing Shadow Dragons operatives had been located and extracted, but the investigation had revealed network penetration operations that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. The encrypted communication that reached Coronado on a gray Tuesday morning carried news that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The investigation triggered by Emma's exposure had led to the identification and neutralization of hostile intelligence networks in 17 countries, resulting in the arrest or elimination of over 200 enemy operatives. The Coronado operation was the keystone that brought down an entire structure, the classified briefing explained. By exposing one network, we gained access to communication systems and operational protocols that revealed the scope of hostile penetration throughout NATO training facilities. But perhaps the most significant victory was the change in military culture that had resulted from the investigation. The casual harassment and systematic exclusion that had been accepted as normal behavior was now recognized as a security vulnerability that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. New recruits arriving at Coronado found themselves in an environment that emphasized merit over appearance, capability over conformity, and mutual support over competitive hierarchy. The changes weren't just policy adjustments, but fundamental shifts in how military personnel understood their responsibilities to each other and to the mission. Sergeant Tommy Roberts, who had witnessed Emma's initial treatment and later recognized her true capabilities, now served as a mentor for NCOs learning to implement the new protocols. His message was simple but profound. Respect wasn't just about being nice to people, it was about operational security. When we judge people by appearance instead of capability, we create vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit, Roberts explained during instructor training sessions. Every time we dismiss someone based on how they look, we might be eliminating exactly the person we need to complete the mission. The dragon tattoo that had revealed Emma's true identity had become something of a legend within special operations communities, inspiring new traditions that honored those who served in shadows. Challenge coins now carried dragon motifs, training facilities displayed artwork celebrating hidden warriors, and military culture began acknowledging that strength came in many forms. Chief Petty Officer Carlos Miller, who had first recognized the significance of Emma's marksmanship skills, established an annual award recognizing personnel who demonstrated exceptional capability despite being initially underestimated. The Emma Mitchell Award for Hidden Excellence became one of the most coveted recognitions in special operations communities. This award recognizes people who prove that real warriors don't need to advertise their capabilities, Miller explained during the first award ceremony. They demonstrate excellence through actions rather than words, serving with quiet dignity while making extraordinary contributions to mission success. The investigation's revelations continued to influence military operations years after the initial exposure. Training protocols developed at Coronado were implemented throughout NATO, creating standardized approaches to identifying and countering hostile intelligence penetration of military training programs. Intelligence sharing agreements were enhanced to prevent hostile networks from simply relocating their operations when exposed in one country. International cooperation in counterintelligence operations was strengthened through lessons learned from the systematic approach that had been required to dismantle the network that Emma had exposed. But beyond the policy changes and institutional reforms, the most lasting impact was the understanding that freedom required eternal vigilance from people whose names would never be widely known, but whose contributions made liberty possible. The Shadow Dragons continued their work in the space between official policy and necessary action, protecting democracy from threats that most citizens would never know existed. Emma Mitchell's story had become part of military folklore, inspiring new generations of service members to understand that honor meant more than personal advancement, that duty required sacrifice without recognition, and that the strongest warriors were often those who appeared most vulnerable until the moment when vulnerability transformed into overwhelming strength. The mission continued, carried forward by people who understood that freedom's price was constant vigilance, and that the most important battles were often fought by those whose existence could never be officially acknowledged, but whose victory made acknowledgement possible.